Good morning, good evening, good afternoon all. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining us again today. I'd like to thank you all for yesterday, which I found really worthwhile and enjoyable, and was lovely to start to engage with all of you. As we go further down this workshop, I think we will find that there's more and more time and opportunity for discussion and asking questions. And so I hope that this will become something of a more interactive session. As I said, I thought the questions posed yesterday in the chat were great, and let's keep that going. It not only keeps me on my toes, but it also makes it a more interactive process, and so I really do hope that that's how we are able to proceed. Just to begin, and the very brief recap of what we covered yesterday. It was a very short session, it's only 1 hour long. We've got 2 hours today. But yesterday, what we looked at were concepts and ideas relating to the assessment of completeness. We talked about the difference and the different definitions of completeness versus coverage, and how they are used often interchangeably, but for our purposes, we do draw a very hard distinction between them. And I also mentioned that there was a particular kind of analytical problem associated with late and delayed registrations, which can make a material difference to one's estimates of completeness. We also then moved on to think about the numerator and the denominator, thinking about potential sources of data, caveats, warnings, cautions to be borne in mind when thinking about those numerators and denominators. And I think that what we started doing there was to alert you to the fact that even though the formulae for estimating completeness are very, very simple, what goes into those numerators and denominators starts to become quite complicated quite quickly when one's dealing with real world data and the kind of problems which we typically encounter. I also, at the end of yesterday's sessions, talked about COVID-19 and how it would impact, or how we expect it to impact, on estimates of completeness, both births and deaths. And really, this is an area of some difficulty, as I try to alert you to. We don't have answers as to how best to do this. I mentioned that there's an issue with the denominators, that most estimates of number of births or deaths so far do not routinely take the impact of COVID into account in those regards. And equally, we can expect that there would be issues associated with either the collection, the collation, the compilation, or the analysis of the data in the numerator. And so at this stage, we can't offer definitive guidance, except to say that when working with estimates of completeness, which cover or can go through that period of the COVID pandemic, I think in most parts of the world, we are hopefully coming out the other side of it. But it does mean that there are at least 2 years of data which are going to have to be very carefully considered before deciding and settling on what you think your estimates of completeness might be. So what we are going to be doing today, and as I said yesterday, we really are going to start getting into the nitty-gritty of it in today's 2 sessions. We're going to be talking about that problem with the numerator, about how do we make adjustments to the numerator for delayed registration. And we'll be talking in the first hour this morning up until the coffee break about how we might best be able to do that. And as I mentioned yesterday, there are 2 separate issues which we need to engage with. The first is a relatively trivial one, which is events which are notified or registered within the statutory period for registering a birth or a death, but nevertheless are registered in the calendar year after they occurred. Okay, so the example I used yesterday was a woman who gives birth just before midnight on the 31st of December one year. Even with the best will in the world, she's not going to be able to register that birth in the same calendar year as it occurred. And so there has to be some accommodation for that. And I'm going to be talking about both how one can use data accurately or approximately to try and get around that problem. The far more interesting problem is one which is commonly encountered across the developing world. In the Stats Cafe yesterday, the speaker from Bhutan, as I mentioned yesterday, showed data which indicated exactly this kind of problem, where there are significant delayed registrations, perhaps stretching many years into the future. In other words, an event which occurred in 2018 might only be reported or registered in 2019, 2020, 2021, or even 2022. And we need to try and find ways in order to best accommodate and allow for those significant delayed registrations in our estimates of completeness, even if they are only an estimate. It will become important, as we'll see in the example I plan to take you through today. We then, after doing that, we're going to take a short coffee break, which I hope will be somewhere around about 50 minutes time. We'll take a 10-15 minute coffee break. And then we are going to proceed to say, well, now that we've got an estimate of the numerator, how do we estimate completeness of birth registration? And we're going to be talking primarily, foremost, about doing so using estimates from the UN World Population Prospects as the denominator. And then at the end of that session, before we close off for the day, we'll be talking about using alternative estimates for that denominator and how we can estimate completeness from that and draw comparisons between the different estimates of completeness which we might be able to derive. So again, just to say, kind of what we're doing for the next hour is what's on the slide here, making adjustments to the numerator for delayed registration. And the first one being those which are registered in the year following the occurrence. And we'll be talking about two methods for doing so. And then we'll be spending most of the session talking about how one allows for significant delayed registrations, and the method we will use is what we call a chain ladder method to estimate the number of registrations which have or events which have already occurred but have not yet been reported or registered with the authorities. Now, the first issue, that's of timely registration, in other words, registration within the statutory period, but it is nonetheless registered in the year following occurrence of the event, is usually easily resolved by extracting and analyzing the data from your civil registration and vital statistics system only after that statutory period has expired. So if your statutory period for notification of births is 30 days, for example, you should not really start analyzing your completeness of your data until the end of January of the year following the year which you're interested in. If we ensure that the data are extracted for a given calendar year only once that statutory window for registration has passed, for all events that might have been able to take place in that period, so allowing for the birth which might have happened minutes before midnight on the 31st of December, that will ensure that all relevant and timeously notified events registered in the year following occurrence in the analysis are included. However, there's another reason for looking at these data, and that is that we still, if we are interested in understanding the overall functioning and efficiency of your civil registration and vital statistics system, you do want to still be able to look at what proportion of events are notified within the statutory notification period. So you can imagine, for example, if you've got a 30-day period for notifying births to your authorities, a birth which occurs in January of one year, but is only notified in July of that same year, will still be registered in the same calendar year as the event occurred, but will be registered late. And we would still want to be able to at least investigate what proportion of the events which are being notified to the authorities are actually being notified in compliance with those statutory periods. It's a measure then of how well the system is able to ensure compliance with regulation, and would also give us some indication, perhaps over time, over many years of data, whether we see an increase in the proportion of births which are being registered with the authorities within the statutory notification period. And so, even though it's not hugely relevant for our estimates of completeness, the idea of an investigation into late registration is also important, because it will give you important insights into the overall nature of your civil registration and vital statistics system. The way that we can investigate those trends in late registration is that we would basically take the unit record data from the civil registration vital statistics system and ask of each record. So if it's a birth in the civil registration system or a death in the civil registration system, we would ask ourselves, for that record, was it registered within the statutory period? Okay, and whether it was, so even allowing for the fact that the birth which occurred on the 31st of December might only be registered the next year, we can still investigate whether it was registered appropriately and within the statutory period. Now, the only way that you're able to do that is if you have exact dates of occurrence and registration in your civil registration data. In other words, you have a precise date of birth or death and a precise date of registration. It might not be sufficient to have only the month and year of registration and the month and year of birth, because that might not be sufficiently fine-grained to allow the identification of those late registrations. We find that typically in a lot of developing countries that the period allowed for registration of births is often substantially longer than the period allowed for the registration of deaths. Often the period allowed for registration of a death is a matter of days, whereas the registration of births might be allowed for up to, say, a month after the event occurred. So we would have to be able to then, in your data would have to be collected and made available in a form which allows you that precise estimation of that precise analysis as to whether any given record was registered early, was registered within the statutory notification period, or whether it was registered late. The alternative, if you're not given those data, there's precise dates of birth and dates of death and dates of registration, which might often be the case. The national statistical officers or the authorities responsible for maintaining that system often don't like releasing information down to the day an event occurred for reasons of confidentiality and privacy. You might then need to try and work with your the data authority responsible for producing those data to routinely include in your data a system-generated flag that marks that registration as having occurred within the statutory period or outside the statutory notification period. And then they don't have to give you the precise dates of occurrence and registration. However, in some situations, in some countries' data, even that is not available. In other words, you're not able to access the precise dates of occurrence and registration, and the authorities are not able or unwilling to provide a system-generated indicator that marks whether the registration occurred late or not. And in the absence of those detailed data, all one can really do is to try and approximate what proportion of events registered in one calendar year are not actually late registrations. And so one would say, if without any further information, you'd have to say what proportion of deaths being registered in 2022 were actually deaths which occurred in 2021. And that would be that's quite a complex investigation, which would require detailed local knowledge and possibly detailed local investigations into those data. But the second adjustment, the adjustment in respect of what we call incurred but not reported events, is much more complex and can be very, very significant. As I mentioned yesterday, often events which have occurred may be reported to the authorities only many, many years after they have occurred. For example, in South Africa, it was until fairly recently a common problem that children would only be registered as a birth just as they were about to start to attend school, because they needed to provide a birth certificate in order to enroll and to register in the schooling system. And where those reported events, those very late reported events, are numerically substantial, estimating completeness based on events reported in the calendar year of occurrence, but only allowing for the late registrations into the beginning of the following year, will result perhaps in a very significant underestimation of your completeness. Yes, it is some kind of estimate of completeness, saying what proportion of births occurring in one year are registered within that year or timeously within the next, but that's not going to give you an overall measure of the completeness of your civil registration and vital statistics system. And to illustrate this problem, I'm going to put the following information up on the slide, on the screen, which is registered South African births from 2011. This is data which was released covering the period up till February 2020, and the data were released last year in 2021. And what we can see in these data is that in 2011, 1,036,000 births were registered, which were registered as occurring in 2011. And there were 950,000 births occurring in 2018, which have been registered. And if we then plot that time series over a period of 9 years of the number of births in South Africa over that period, and get a laser pointer here, and please note that I've distorted the vertical axis here. It only starts at 850,000, so we can more carefully identify the trend. And if one looks at this pattern, you can see that from 2011 through to 2014, there was a very gradual decline in the number of registered births. In 2015 and 16, we can see it here, those registered births fell very dramatically and then recovered a bit in 2017, 18, and 19 to a level of about 950,000 for the last 2 years for which we had complete data. And if you were presented with simply with those data, I'd ask you to tell a story about those data. You could tell a story simply by looking at this. You could say, well, maybe there was some major event in South Africa in 2015 and 16 and 17, which caused fewer women to give birth. Okay, women delayed having their births for a couple of years for some reason. It might be things like an economic crisis, although there wasn't one in South Africa at the time. Or you might say, well, looking at that trend from 2011 through to 2014, there seems to have been a gradual decline in the number of registered births from about 1.036 million down to 1.023 million births over those 4 years. And you could tell yourself a story if you were looking at these data with absolutely no context, that certainly up to there, that might tell a story of declining fertility in the country. That's even allowing for population momentum effects, gradually the number of births in the country is declining. A third story, and this is the fun part of demography, is when you have to tell yourself stories and make up stories to try and explain what you're seeing. A third thing would say, well, it could have, there was something which happened there. Maybe there was a collapse in the civil registration system in that year. For some reason, officers weren't registering births, or the birth notification forms weren't being transmitted to the National Statistical Authority. And so what comes through is this very sudden drop from 972,000 to 916,000 between 2015 and 2016. And you'd say, well, maybe there's some structural problem with the notification of births. One of the possible explanations might be that in 2016 and 2017, a previous system which had been instituted to register births directly within hospitals. In other words, a woman would give birth in a public health facility, and there would literally be a member of the Department of Home Affairs there in the hospital, in each hospital, to register each birth literally as it occurred, and then the information would be transmitted. And maybe in 2015 and 2016, that system momentarily collapsed for whatever reason, structural reasons. But the problem is that by looking at these data, one doesn't actually have a clue. If one only had that information. I've offered at least 3 different possible stories as to which one might be true, what might explain that pattern of registered births in the country. But without any further information, one would be at something of a loss to say what has happened. And so this is the first part of that. In all demographic work, and in many instances, the assessment of the vital statistics data and completeness is a branch of demographic work, is that you have to become a detective of sorts. You put on get your magnifying glass out, you put on your hat, and you go and identify and say, is there a crime scene here of some kind, which we need to be able to explain and produce the evidence for, whether it is that there was actually a period effect in the pattern of women's childbearing, was there systems failure in the Department of Home Affairs, etc. So that is often the kind of starting point which we look at. But what we can then do, and this is where the bulk of this first session is going to concentrate on, is to say, well, actually we have more data than that for South Africa covering that period. And these are the data which we have in South Africa for 2011 to 2020. And what I showed you on the previous slide was that total number there on the far right-hand side of the screen. But what we can see happening here now is that we can see that in 2011, for example, there were 911,353 births which occurred in 2011 and which were registered 0 years after 2011. So also registered in 2011. Okay, and these data have been adjusted for the late registration, the registration in 2012 of those births which were notified properly within the statutory period of those occurring in 2011. But we can see that there was a further 74,000 births which occurred in 2011, which were not timely, but were registered in 2012. 21,000 occurred in 2011, which were registered in 2013, and a small number, which you can, if you do, you can do the mental maths yourself, which you'll start saying, hang on, what's going on here? In 2011, there were 353 births, which were notified 9 calendar years later, which would have been in 2020. And we can see over here in this bottom corner here, this first 0, that there were apparently 0 births which occurred in 2019, which were registered in 2020. And that is because these data were produced literally at the end of the close off of the statutory notification period. And so there were, in the data, there were no late registrations of births occurring in 2019, which had as yet to be reported in 2020. Okay, but those might have come through a little bit later, but they hadn't been processed by the statistical agency at the time. And suddenly we can start getting a rather different picture of things in these data. We can see, for example, that there's a quite dramatic drop in the 1 year late registration of births, from 74,000 in 2011 through to 22,000 in 2018. We can see that over time that there are still a number of births which are being registered 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 calendar years late. And certainly in the births in 2011, this would seem to indicate that barely 88% of all births which were ultimately notified to the authorities as having occurred in 2011, only 88% of them were registered within the year of occurrence. And fully 5% of the births were registered in 2013 or later. And so if we are now, and this is kind of very similar to the example produced by the speaker from Bhutan yesterday, if we look at these births in 2018, which occurred in 2018, there are about 22,000 which occurred in 2018, which were registered late in 2019, and there's about 1,000 which were registered very late at the start of 2020. But if we were to use these data with the knowledge that certainly in 2011, there had been significant numbers of births which had been registered 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 years late, we obviously haven't got to that point yet with the 2018 data, because those 1,000 late registrations are only those which were notified by January 2020. And obviously, if we get the data in 2020, we'd have no idea of what births occurred in 2018, which might still be registered in 2021, 2022, 2023, or 2024. And so with this knowledge that we have a pattern of substantially delayed registration of births in our civil registration vital statistics system, you have to ask yourself the question that if we want to understand the completeness of births registered in 2019, we're going to have to allow for the fact that there are births which might be registered in all the future years, which are the ones marked with zeros, where we don't yet have data, where there might still be births registered which occurred in 2019. And so if we do not allow for this, we're going to get a rather misleading picture of registration of the births in more recent years, 2017, 18, and 19 particularly, because the comparison with the actual number of events is going to say, well, we expected maybe 1 million or 1.05 million births in South Africa, and we have 954,000 registered births in 2019, which were registered in 2019. But that would give us an underestimate of the completeness of our civil registration system. Yes, it is the completeness of the civil registration system of those who are registered within the year of birth or within the statutory period in the year following that birth. But there's clearly other births which are not going to be coming through in our system. And if we are trying to get an overall picture as to what is happening with our civil registration and vital statistics system and our estimate of completeness, we really do need to accommodate this this effect in the data. And as I was very gratified to see, South Africa is not the only country which experiences this problem. And so it's the kind of thing which any country, any developing country, should be looking at routinely as a matter of course in their analysis of their data. So what we need to do is really think about how we best adjust for these births. And I must emphasize now that, of course, there's a strong element of extrapolation, which is going to be going on here. We don't actually know from the data provided to us in 2021 of the births up till January 2020 in South Africa, how many births will actually be registered late here. But we know that the chances of them being zero are very small, because we can look at the past pattern of these late registrations. And so what we're going to do is we're going to effectively going through a process of extrapolation to say, how do we use this information of this portion of the triangle for which we do have data to try and get an idea as to what the real impact of late registration is going to be in future years going forward, which will give us a starting point for trying to estimate the completeness of our registration of births. And obviously, when we get through to around about 2028, 2029 in South Africa, we'll be able to look back more or less completely at the births which occurred in 2019 and get a final estimate as to what the completeness of births occurring in 2019 was. But we don't really want to wait for 10 years before we get that estimate of completeness, because as I suggested yesterday, the analogy is that you're then driving a car, only looking in the rearview mirror to say, well, what was back down the road 10 years ago? When actually what we're trying to understand is what was the completeness, what's our best estimate of completeness now, even allowing for the fact that some births might be registered very late. So this brings us on to what we call the chain ladder method for estimating IBNR events. IBNR stands for incurred but not reported. In other words, the event has actually happened, we just simply don't know about it yet. And the methodology which we use, which is explained in quite some detail in the guidelines in mathematical terms, but I'm not going to go through that for the purposes of this exercise because it's all implemented in the spreadsheet for you, is an application of a well-established actuarial approach to estimate the final likely number of events, allowing for the fact that events that have occurred in the recent past may not be reported for several more years. And this branch of actuarial work emanated from the analysis of both general and life insurance claims, where an event might occur, but you might only be notified as the insurer of that event multiple years into the future. And if you don't make allowance for that, you might be putting yourself in financial difficulty. So there's a strong reason for trying to get as accurate an approach for trying to estimate what we call IBNR, incurred but not reported events, into the future. And we can apply exactly this method to our current situation of what do we do with incurred but not reported births in our society or in our population, in our country, to try and understand what is going to happen into the future. Now, the important assumption of this method is that we have to be able to assume that past patterns of delayed registration will persist into the future. In other words, that this gradual runoff of very late registrations of births will by and large persist into the future. And that raises the question as to whether there have been policy changes. If there's been a policy change, for example, which imposes significant penalties on mothers or parents for late registration of births to make it harder and less desirable or less possible to register a birth 4 or 5 years late as the child's about to go to school. If there's been a policy change over the period you're looking at, you do need to allow for that and actually separate out your data into the period before the policy change and the period after the policy change in order to try and ensure that that assumption that the past patterns of delayed registration will persist into the future will still be able to be made, and that assumption holds. We also have to flag here that maybe COVID-19 might violate that assumption. That's, as I mentioned yesterday when talking about the implications of COVID-19 for registration, one of the things which happened was that in many instances, in many countries, individual registration offices were shut for periods of time, either because the staff members got infected or their offices were closed for decontamination back in the days when we thought that that was an important preventative health measure. We know now it's not. But there were periods when those offices were shut, and the parent might say, well, I'm sorry, but I wanted to register my child's birth and I didn't, and now several years later, I'm finally getting around to registering my child's birth because they need to go to school. So there might be consequences of particularly of an administrative nature of the closing of offices or the unavailability of registration offices during COVID-19, which might violate that past pattern of delayed registration. And again, all one has to be able to do is look at your own experience in your own country and speak to the authorities responsible for those registration of vital events and say, was this a problem? Are we likely to be encountering this? We know, for example, in South Africa, that in the first 5 or 6 months of the pandemic in 2020, we were not able to get any meaningful handle on infant mortality. That's deaths under the age of 1. And that was because in South Africa, our national population register works that you can only be taken off the population register, it'd be registered as a death, if you were prior on the population register and had been registered as a birth. But the closure of the offices, the national lockdown, which we experienced for 5 weeks in March, April 2021, meant that a lot of births weren't registered. And because those births weren't registered or hadn't yet been captured in the system, deaths of those births which hadn't yet been registered were not coming through. And so we were suddenly seeing a very odd pattern of infant and child mortality. And so one does need to be alert to these things. We certainly can draw on international experience to say this is a matter of some consequence. We also have to be able to assume that even if they're incomplete, in other words, even if the births here along the bottom where there are these zeros, even if those are incomplete, the data which we do have are accurate and are error-free in terms of recording of the years of occurrence and registration, which is not too much of an assumption, given by and large the automated nature of these things. But one has to just flag that there is an assumption there. So what we require to apply this method, and I'm going to take you through in a very broad conceptual framework how this method works, is we require that tabulation of vital events by the year in which they occur and the number of years after occurrence that event was registered. Okay, and that is exactly the table which I have provided here, and where I've flagged again that you need to ensure that there are no births there which occurred in 2011, which were registered in 2012, which were actually timelessly notified, because those should really be included in the year 0 registration, because they were timely registrations. So you do need to be careful of that. But what we then do is we can imagine as a stylized representation that this cell A over here would represent the births which occurred in 2015 and were registered in 2015. The cell B over here would be a birth which occurred in 2016 and which was registered in 2017 after the statutory period. Over here in 2019, cell C, we have a birth which occurred in 2019 and was registered in 2020, but we don't have the complete data set for 2020 because of the timing of the production of that data set from the stats from our National Statistical Office, which they put available on their website. And so in this gray shaded area, this represents information which is either substantively incomplete or completely non-existent as to what events might have occurred in that period. And so to go back to our South African data again, we can see this again, we can see the zeros, which are effectively these gray areas. And in fact, we're going to treat this last diagonal from the 1046 going up that diagonal to the 353 also as incomplete, because those 1,046 births are those which occurred in 2018, which were notified to the authorities in 2020, but the data set was produced in January or February of 2020. And so that is certainly an incorrect and incomplete measure of births in that year. And you can certainly see the drop off in each case over here, which reflects that is an alert that those might be incomplete. So what we're going to do with applying this method, and as I say, the spreadsheet, which I'm going to introduce you to now, covers this in far more detail. We're going to work by accumulating the events for each year of occurrence. And then we are going to calculate what we call cumulative late registration factors for each year of registration relative to the preceding year. So what we are going to do here then is, instead of saying we had 911,000 births in 2011 registered in 2011 and 74,000 registered late in 2012, we'll now accumulate these upwards. So we'll take 911 and 353 and say the total number of cumulative births occurring in 2011 should be registered by 2012 would be that plus that. Registered by 2013 would be that, etc. And then we first we're going to work with the cumulated number of events occurring in each of these years. And then we are going to say, well, for the late registration year 1 relative to year registration 0, which is the year in which the births occurred, we're going to derive what we call a cumulative late registration factor by saying, for all the years for which we have valid data, we don't have valid data for the cell C over here because we know it's incomplete, but for the total number of years for which we have valid data for year 1, we're going to add up all those cumulated events and divide it by the cumulated events for a block of the same area, the same number of years, 4 years in each case in this example, for the preceding year. And we'll express that then as a ratio of the sum of those events relative to the sum of those cumulated events over there. In our data then, just to go back to the same South African example, we would first, as I say, accumulate these number of events upwards. So 911, 353 plus the 74,000, which were actually notified in year 1. So we've got accumulated 985,000 births registered by the end of year 1 of those occurring in 2011 and going forward. And we do that for each of the years going forward. Obviously, for the shaded areas over here, this is going to, those are going to be zeros. And so we're going to be adding 0 each time. So the accumulated number of events is going to remain unchanged in those areas where there are the zeros. And we will then derive what we call our late registration factors and say, well, for year 3 over here, we have valid information from 2011 through to 2016. And for year 2, we have a complete set of records from 2011 through to 2016. And we derive our cumulated late registration factor for year 3 as being the sum of those green cells divided by the sum of those yellow cells. I apologize for this little portion over here, which is shaded, that actually is the next cell along the graph, which I did here. So that cell is actually a valid number, the 915309. It's not an unknown cell. I apologize for that little portion over there. But what we end up with then is we have what we call these cumulative late registration factors for each year going forward in time and for each year of late registration. And what we then do is we then operationalize this by deriving an expected number of as yet not reported. These are the events which we think might have occurred, but we haven't been told they have occurred. We derive an expected number of future events accumulated, by applying those late registration factors for each year to our observed data. And once we get the cumulated number of future events for all future years, we can then get the annual increment of those late registrations by differencing. So back in our example over here, all the cells shaded or unshaded cells, i.e. the white ones, are our original data. But what we can see going along here in the pinkish shaded areas of this triangle is that we're able to then use those cumulated late registration factors to get an approximation as to how many cumulated events which occurred in 2019 might be registered by the end of 2020. And so we had 954,000 births occurring in 2019, registered in 2019. And based on the cumulated registration factor for year one, which was that value of 1.047, sorry, let's go over here, that 1.047 would have been the sum of from 985,727 down to 949,487, divided by the sum of 911,353 down to 927,113. If we took that divided by that, you're going to get this factor of 1.047. When we apply that to the number of births in 2019 at year 0, we multiply that by 1.047, and we come up with a number of just under 1 million cumulated births, which we expect to have been registered by the end of 2020, and 1.018 million births by the end of 2022, etc., going forward. And we can then difference this out and say, well, if we expect by the end of 2022 1.0186 million births, and by the end of 2021 there would have been 1.011 registered births. Well, the difference between those two will tell you how many extra births are going to be notified, we expect, to the authorities during that calendar year. And so if we start looking towards the end of this table now, we end up with a very different indication as to what we think is happening with our births. When we looked at the births which had been notified in that initial year, we saw that they fell quite sharply, they're down to 876,000, and then they increased quite dramatically. But when we look by the end of year 7 years after these events had actually occurred, we see a rather different pattern of the number of ultimately registered births, which we expect to find in our system. And as I've said, these are an extrapolation. They are not absolute numbers. They are not true numbers, but they will allow us to compensate for the fact that we're expecting significant numbers of late registration of births in our population. So what I'm going to do now is just show you how the resources spreadsheet implements this correction to our data. And the resources sheet that I'm going to show you is available here on the Google Drive under meeting documents, under practical material. It's that resources.xls x file over there, and you can download it. And it has this example embedded in it. And the way we are going to use this spreadsheet to correct for those very late incurred but not reported events is that on the first page of the sheet, under the Inputs tab, we're going to choose our country. It has all the countries which are listed in the UN World Population Prospects. We'd say, what's our start year for our data? This can go through from 1990 up to 2030. So I've built in some redundancy into the system. It should be able to still work for several more years. The end year of our data, again, from 1990 up to 2030. We don't worry about this portion, line 7 of the input yet, because that is what we're going to be covering after the coffee break. But what we do need to do here is at line 11, there is a question asked saying, have the data been corrected for current registration in the following year? Now, remember that this is that analysis which you say, what happens to that birth which occurs just before midnight on the 31st of December, but is registered in the following year and is registered currently, in other words, in accordance with the statutory regulations. And so this question asks, have you corrected the data for that effect, and have you made sure that the data are extracted where the current registration the following year is still treated as an occurrence in that year? If you answer yes, as I have, because that's how I worked with the South African data, you just select yes there. If you select no, you'll get a further box which appears, which says what proportion of registrations in any subsequent year are not late registrations in your current year. Okay, and you enter an estimate derived from whatever investigations you can make into your local data to say what proportions of registrations are not late. In other words, so of those births in, say, 2020, what proportion of the registrations in 20 were not late registrations from the previous years or previous years before that? But in our case, we will say we have those data have been corrected for current registration in the following year, because that's how the data were extracted. What we then do is we go to the next tab, which is marked here, Adjust Numerator. I'm just going to make this a little bit, I'm just going to zoom in a bit over here. And what I insert in these green shaded cells, and it's the convention of the spreadsheet that anything which is green shaded is basically an input into the calculations. Anything which is not shaded is a calculation, and it is based on a formula. So you shouldn't change anything which is not in a green shaded cell. And what we're going to do is we're going to put our data directly into that matrix. If you have a good memory, you'll see this is exactly the data which I was able to extract from the Stats South Africa data available from their website, and which I used in the slides. And we put those data there. Off to the far right-hand side over here are all the calculations. I'll take you through those just now, but those are put off to the right because for many people, all they're really interested in is the answer of what is the effect of making this adjustment. And that is placed directly beneath the input data. It's marked as output. And that is the grab of the output, which I put on the slide over there. I pointed out that you could, by differencing these numbers from each other, you get an estimate of the late registrations in the, say, in 2020 of those occurring in 2019 by differencing. And you can see that the total over here at the very end there after 9 years is the same total which we had if we were to sum all those things. So this spreadsheet allows you to make the correction automatically, provided that you have extracted the data appropriately. If you're interested in how the method works, well, firstly, the formulae are provided in the guidelines and the explanation of how one, conceptually, how one does this in the guidelines. And in fact, the guidelines have grabs of a whole lot of the intermediate steps here to show you how it is done in practice. But over here at the end of the spreadsheet, sorry, whoopsie, over here are the calculations which are done. You can see that in this first block here, it's marked cleaning and correction for delayed registration. The formula gets fairly complicated because I've tried to automate everything, but if you are familiar and very proficient at the use of Excel, you can follow what these formulae do. But effectively, what this does is that it either, if on the inputs page, if you'd had not been able to correct your data for current registration the following year, and you'd entered a value into that cell, then it would make that correction to the tabulation of the data which you'd used as your input. And it also sets as 0 this partially complete diagonal, because we know that we don't actually have full data for 2020, which would be the births occurring in 2019, which are registered a year late. And so it ensures that those very small values in our original input data are ignored because we know that they cannot reflect a complete year's worth of data. The next block then accumulates those numbers just by aggregating that. So in year 0, it's obviously just that cell over there. We then add over here the 74374 to get the 985727. So we get the accumulated numbers by the end of each year for each year of occurrence. From that, we derive our accumulated late registration factors for each year relative to every other year. It's important to note that in general, you'd expect the series to be decreasing. In other words, saying that you expect more late registrations closer to when they occurred than much later after they occurred. You can see that these late registration factors gradually fall off and get closer and closer to 1 as we get closer or further and further out from when those events were notified. But those results then are then taken out and placed in the output, which is then different, to provide us now with an estimate of what we think over here to be the real number of births which occurred in 2011, the real number of births which occurred in 2016. You can see that number, 930,000, is including births which occurred in 2016, registered in 2016, occurred 2016, registered in 17, registered in 18, registered in 19, and then some estimate of the number of births which are going to still be registered of births which occurred back in 2016, which might be notified to the authorities in the future. And you can, by comparison of these numbers with those registered in the first year, or registered in the year in which the births occurred, we can start seeing the kind of increase in these estimated number of births. It's the order of between 5 and 7% typically over various years. And that will translate directly into a different estimate of a completeness, because remember, our estimate of completeness is our registered events divided by our estimated true number of events. And if we now allow for all these extra events which are likely to come through into the future, we're going to get a slightly different total, in this case, a materially different total of the number of events which have actually occurred, and which will therefore tell us, by the time all those late registrations have been done, what do we expect our level of completeness to be then, as opposed to what is our level of completeness of the births which were registered under in the same year as they occurred, which is another measure of completeness. And what we'll be doing after the coffee break is to start saying, let's combine these two with the Unwpp estimates to try and come up with different metrics of the completeness of births. So I would like to take a break now. If people have questions about this, we can stay online for a bit, or otherwise, I suspect we will have quite some time at the end of the next session where we do the combination with the Unwpp births to have a broader discussion. But if there are any burning questions, perhaps either put them in the chat or raise your hand and we can discuss those now.
Bonifacio from Samoa put a question in there, but it might have been resolved.
Sorry, would you mind turning your camera on today? It really helps me to imagine who I'm talking to.
Sorry, it's me. So I think Bonifacio from Samoa did ask something around about half an hour ago, but it might have been resolved. Bonifacio?
Okay.
you still want to ask a question, or is it okay?
It's okay. Thank you very much. It's been resolved.
Okay.
The question has been answered during the explanation by Professor. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Okay. Sorry for missing that. I confess I have two computer monitors, one of which has a presentation on it. And the other monitor has windows of the chat and kind of previews of the slides. So occasionally things get lost. If you do feel that I have missed you, just please raise your hand, because I will see that flash up at the top of my screen. I apologize for missing your question.
It's all right. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. If there are any other questions, pile in now or into the chat. Otherwise, let's take a 10-minute break and let's convene again at 8:10. I will be able to join you then. I see that there's a question from Anand from India. Hi, so could you please show in the Excel sheet the step after accumulation for every year, especially what would be the denominator to calculate the accumulated late registration factors? Okay, let me try and get this over here. Oops, it would help if I understood my own spreadsheet relatively well. These accumulated late registration factors. Okay, I have to apologize that the formula which is used, which involves sums, offset, maximas, count blanks, etc. It's a nightmare of a formula. That was designed to make us flexible in the sense that you could enter up to 10 years worth of data here, but you might only have 5 years worth of data. And so in order to be able to calculate those accumulated late registration factors, to make it as flexible and to make sure you aren't aggregating information which is not there, the formula is pretty horrendous. But to show you, if I were to do this manually, the accumulated late registration factor for year 1 would be the sum of all the accumulated events in year 1 for which we have data. In other words, something which is not shaded in that orange thing, divided by the sum of the equivalent number of cells in the previous year. See, I made a mistake there. And I'm going to pray very hard this comes out to be 1.047. There you go. Okay. So, and likewise, that 1.012 would be the sum of the accumulated events for down to the last year for which we have real data, divided by the sum of the accumulated events in the previous year and the same number of years. So that's 7 years, and that's 7 years. And again, I'll pray that comes out to be 1.012, and there you go. Okay, so Ananda, I hope that answers your question. As I said, the formula, which it took me about a week to work that formula out, is simply to make it flexible for an immense variety of situations, but it does actually do what it says on the tin. There's a question from Sheila Sarkar saying, since it's time series or data using an extrapolation method, is there any effective time in this method? Yes. Let me go back. Sorry, let me just go back to my slideshow here. Let me go back and Sheila Sarkar, the answer lies over there in this second paragraph. The method requires the assumption that past patterns of delayed registration will persist into the future. Okay, and I did flag that if there are policy changes, if there might be something which has disrupted those past patterns of delayed registration or might have aggravated those past patterns of delayed registration, for example, COVID-19, you might need to worry about this. And so one of the things that you might say, well, why do I only allow up to 10 years of this? Well, because over a 10-year period, the chances there might be some time-based effects. become increasingly likely. And so the method is, and the guidelines point this out, saying this method should not be applied for anything longer than 10 years, and you should be cautious of applying it for up to 10 years unless you are fairly certain that there have not been any significant policy changes or other external events which are going to violate that assumption. But over a period of 4 or 5 years, unless you are completely aware of a significant policy change, the method will generally work, and has been shown to work in a variety of different situations. Of course, the proof of the pudding of this is going to come, way back or way into the future, somewhere around about, at the end of 2022, once we get the data in 2023, we'll be able to say, were there actually 950, sorry, that's the wrong slide, next slide. Were there actually 1.018 million registered births by the end of 2022, which had been registered in 2019, and we can only investigate that after the fact. But in the meantime, if we have this problem, one of the things we say, and this is what we'll be doing after the break, is to say, well, that provides us with one measure of completeness, but this is going to give us another measure of completeness, and we need to be able to at least say, kind of how material is that impact, and is it something we have to be worrying about? And the ultimate level of completeness might not be an exact measure of completeness, but might be more representative of your civil and registration vital statistics system than simply the births which occurred up until the period which you actually know they have been registered. Also, it would be misleading if you took that number for 2019 and that number for 2018 and that number for 2017, the accumulated number registered at the end of each period, and use that as your measure of completeness, because that one is going to include information for 6 or 7 years, whereas this one's only going to include information from the year of registration. And so if you only use the data actually available to you, that would be even more distorted, because each year would incorporate a different number of years of late registration, which have been accommodated into the data. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. I've taken a little bit more time. I'm not overly worried about kind of running much beyond the end of the session in the next bit. So can we still take 10 minutes break, just to allow myself to get a cup of coffee, and we will reconvene round about 18 minutes past 1 Bangkok time. Thank you very much. I look forward to that, catching up with you then. If any of you have any questions, please dump them in the chat while you grab your cup of coffee or your lunch, and I will do my best to answer them over the next 10 minutes as well, possibly via chat. Thank you.
Put a folder saying for printing, just to make sure that it's that we get things that need to
Okay, all. Welcome back. I do hope you have at least managed to arm yourself with some lunch or a cup of coffee or something. Sorry, apologies. Okay, so what we did in the last hour was to introduce to you the idea that it might be necessary to adjust your numerator in the case where you have significant number of often very delayed events for your, sorry, it's doesn't seem to be sharing at the moment. Yeah, it's not sharing. A significant number of perhaps very delayed events in your numerator. And that, as you can imagine, will feed in to the analysis of the completeness of birth registration in your country. And so what I'm going to be doing now in the remaining time available to us today is to really start that process of implementing the computation, the calculation of completeness of birth registration. So what I'm going to be doing now is be talking specifically about how we compare the number of births which we have derived in our numerator with that which is produced by the United Nations World Population Prospects, which is produced by the United Nations Population Division. And I'll be talking a little bit about what those UNWP data are, some limitations of those data, and how to implement it in the spreadsheet which is provided with these guidelines. And then I will be moving on to saying, well, what happens if you've got other estimates of births derived from other sources? And how does one draw comparisons or estimates of the completeness of birth registration using data of the number of births estimated from those other sources? So when we talk about using or estimating the completeness of birth registration using the United Nations World Population Prospects, this really is the first essential check on overall completeness. It's something which one can do at a national level. Provides a benchmark against which you can assess other estimates of completeness. It's not necessarily the definitive answer, but it does provide a very valuable stake in the ground as to what your overall level of completeness might be. Now, if you think back to yesterday's session where we talked about the estimation of completeness, what this would mean then is that we are saying that our completeness estimate of birth registration in some year T would be our numerator, the CRVS births in that year, which might be adjusted for very late registration, as I've just explained in the earlier session today, divided by the estimate of the births in that same year derived from the UN World Population Prospects. And we multiply that by 100 to be able to express it in percentage terms. And following on from the previous session, we can refine that idea of the numerator to reflect either the CRVS births occurring and reported in the same year, which is what I would term year zero completeness, or alternatively, the CRVS births estimated to have occurred in year T, allowing for that very late registration. Remember, that's what the incurred but not reported analysis allowed us to do, is say how many births do we actually expect to have occurred in a particular calendar year, regardless of whether we've been informed of them or not. And that measure is what we would term ultimate completeness. Okay, so that's a measure of saying, once all the late registered births and very late registered births have been brought into the system, what is our estimate of completeness at that point in time? So to estimate the completeness of birth registration using the UNWP, the data requirements to adopt the approach are minimal. They require merely an estimate of the number of births possibly accommodating delayed registration in any calendar year, and the number of births in that calendar year which have been derived from the UN World Population Prospects. Now we can also further disaggregate both the numerator and the denominator, for example, by sex, to give an estimate of sex-specific completeness of birth registration. So we could take, in terms of this formula from the previous slide, the completeness of male birth registration in year T would be the CRVS, male births in year T, divided by the Unwpp male births in year T, and similarly for females. Okay, and if we were to do that, we could then derive sex-specific estimates of completeness of birth registration, which might be vitally important for things such as inequality assessments. Are there important sex-specific differentials in the registration of male and female births in your country, in your setting? Just to help you get a better understanding of what the United Nations World Population Prospects are. Okay, I'm going to give you just a feeling for what is in those data. This is an exercise which has been conducted by the UN Population Division since 1951. Okay, so the Population Division was formed, I think I stand corrected, in either 1946 or 1948. And really from their very beginning, they said that one of our tasks is to produce estimates of global population and global population trends. Since then, they've been through 26 rounds of producing these estimates, which have become known as the UN World Population Prospects. The most recent revision was issued in 2019. In general, the intention of the UNWPP is to produce those estimates every 2 years. Okay, so we should expect, hopefully later this year, the 2020-2021 revision of those world population prospects, although, as I said yesterday, it is not entirely clear the extent to which the impact of COVID is going to be incorporated in those, or whether the ultimate release of that revision might be delayed until we've got a better sense as to what the impact of COVID might be. Now, the approach adopted by the UNWPP in producing those global estimates has been to use what in demography we call a cohort component population projection approach, okay, which is basically the gold standard method of doing a population projection. Is that what one does is effectively that your population of 10-year-olds must be your population of 11-year-olds the next year, except for those who might have died between the ages of 10 and 11 over the course of that year, and any migrants aged between 10 and 11 that year. And so one can build up the projection of the population by taking the population of a given age in 1 year, say there must be the next age in the following year. But what is being increasingly refined, even though the underlying logic of a cohort component population projection approach is absolutely standard, what is being done with the UNWPP are increasingly sophisticated techniques used to estimate the trends in fertility, mortality, which includes the impact of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as migration, which are the essential forces of demographic change, which is going to impact on your estimates of the population going forward. So even though the overall methodology of a cohort component population projection is pretty much cast in stone, increasingly sophisticated methods are being used to say what are and have been and will be the trends in fertility, mortality, and migration over time. A further major advantage of the WPP is that the methodology is incredibly well described. I've provided the link there on the PDF of this session, both the hyperlink to the most recent data, the most recent revision, as well as the methodology description are clickable, and you'll be able to click straight through if you want to understand exactly what methods they are using to estimate fertility, mortality, and migration. In particular, the move in recent years has been to using Bayesian techniques to estimate those trends in fertility and mortality and to project them into the future. But a major advantage of the UNWPP is that there are immense efforts undertaken at a national level to ensure coherence and consistency with what they are producing with past data. So in those UNWPP, the projections always start in 1950, which reflects the start of their engagement in this area since 1951. And as we get more information about what trends might have been in the past, either through demographic reconstructions or the availability of new census data, the availability of recent survey data, for example, a DHS or a mixed study, the information which is used to derive those estimates in fertility, mortality, and migration is continually updated and is kind of worked with to ensure that both the estimates of the population numbers as well as the trend in those demographic forces are coherent and consistent, not only with past data, but also with census and survey estimates. And for this reason, the UNWPP is often used as the gold standard reference for demographic work and estimation at a national level because of its methodology is completely transparent, because the results are made consistent over now an extended period of time, going back 72 years till 1950, that when the efforts to ensure that coherence and consistency does make these estimates more reliable than most others. However, when we talk about the UNWPP, one must always bear in mind that those UNWPP do not represent an objective truth. Okay, what the UNWPP might reveal or describe for your country might not actually be what you are objectively seeing on the ground. On the first hand, in the first case, as with any population projection, that future is unknowable. And so the robustness of those projections depends crucially on the assumptions of the future trajectories of the components of demographic change. Now, the UNWPP, we recommend in the guidelines that we use those, but there are two key limitations that need to be borne in mind in using them. Okay, the first is that the UNWPP offers only national level projections. So one doesn't get, for example, provincial or district level estimates of your population. We only have national level estimates, and much of the data which one might want to use might not be directly available from those UNWPP data. Secondly, as I've mentioned, there's no allowance for the impact of COVID-19 as yet. And so the UNWPP estimates, for example, of the number of deaths in your country in 2019, in 2020 and 2021, and possibly 2022, might be severely underestimated if your country has experienced a particularly bad pandemic. And that is something which needs to be borne in mind in using those data for this particular point in time. Also, it needs to be borne in mind that the process of producing the WPP is intense. You can imagine if you have to produce detailed national level population projections for 200 and something countries and territories around the world every 2 years, needing to take into account all the newly available data and to run the projections and to ensure they are consistent, they might not completely reflect country-specific dynamics. Okay, and as a result, while we say that these are the gold standard and we recommend and we strongly urge the use of UNPP data wherever possible, they should not be used uncritically. And really, when working with these data and data from the UNWPP, you really do need to ascertain and convince yourselves that the country-specific results and estimates of births, deaths, and for the estimation of sex-specific birth registration completeness, the sex ratio at birth, are in agreement with local expert knowledge. It is not always the case that that those will be in agreement. In my own country, for example, South Africa, there's quite a marked discrepancy between what local demographers think is the age structure of the population, particularly at older ages, versus what the UNWPP says is the age structure of the population at older ages. We see that the UNWPP tends to assume much higher levels of mortality above about age 70 than we think is appropriate. But be that as it may, one understands that the process of producing these estimates is intense. They cannot go do a deep dive into their results for each and every country and territory and say, does this really conform with local knowledge and local experience? And so really this is just a heads up that you need to, when working with the UNWPP data, even though we say it is the gold standard, even though we recommend it, that you should not just take them as some version of an absolute objective truth associated with these data and use them without any thought whatsoever. Now, the spreadsheet which we produced in parallel with the guidelines uses the derived estimates of births by calendar year, as we described in the session earlier today, to produce estimates of completeness relative to the UNWPP on both what we'd call a year zero as well as an ultimate basis. Okay, and so what I'm going to be doing now is to take you through the next step of how to use that spreadsheet to be able to derive estimates of completeness based on the UNWPP data. I'm going to call up my spreadsheet again, and this is the same spreadsheet which we were working on earlier this morning, or earlier this afternoon in Bangkok time. And when we were working with the spreadsheet, one of the things we did was we identified that there were significant late registrations occurring many years after the fact, and we derived an estimate of the cumulated number of births which might have occurred by the end of an extended period into the future, allowing for that for those late registrations. In order to use the spreadsheet, if we go back to the inputs sheet now, and we're going to carry on sophisticating our use and work with the spreadsheet, is that we are still going to specify the country which we want to work with. So we've got all the countries from the UNWPP data. We're still going to say what is our start year and our end year. If we need to adjust our numerator, we're going to do that process over there on the adjust numerator spreadsheet, and we'll make whatever adjustments we think are appropriate, using that analysis of incurred but not reported events to come up with an estimate of the total number of events available to us. In line 7 of the data of the input sheet, we have a field which is marked UNWPP data, and if you click on that drop-down box over here, you'll see that there are a number of possibilities which you could use to compare with various sources of data. And obviously, whatever you put in the numerator must correspond to these various tabulations from the UNWPP. You can do analysis of sex, of the completeness of death registration by both sexes combined, for deaths for males, deaths for females, infant deaths by both sexes, child deaths under 5 for both sexes, or births for both sexes, and births for males and births for females. And there's a final entry there for other non-UNWPP data, and that's if you want to make use of data from some other source to the exclusion of the UNWPP. You might ask yourself why these combinations of metrics, deaths by both sexes. You can see that we don't do infant deaths for males and females separately. We don't do child deaths for males and females. And this is simply because the UNWPP data files, which are routinely available, do not necessarily allow the ready extraction of, say, the number of child deaths of girls under the age of 5 in a particular calendar year. And so that is a limitation imposed by what is available in the UNWPP data. And it's not entirely possible with what they put in the public domain, which I gave the link on the previous website, to estimate from the information in the public domain the number of child deaths for females, for example, under 5, or the infant deaths under the age of 1 for a particular sex. In terms of the births, we can either do births by both sexes, as males and females combined, or we can compare with the births for males from the UNWPP and the births for females from the UNWPP. Those estimates, those sex-specific estimates of births, are not routinely tabulated and provided by the UNWPP, but if one is able to use the information which they give on the sex ratio at birth in any given calendar year to provide an apportionment of the total number of births, which is one of the fields that do provide in their data, to apportion those total births between males and females for any given calendar year. Just so this is not a completely black box. I will reveal to you that if you right-click here and hit unhide over there, buried in the spreadsheet is a very large database which has been extracted from the UNWPP for every country in the world from 1990 through to 2030. And for every calendar year, of the number of deaths, the male deaths, the female deaths, total number of births, infant deaths, under 5 deaths. We then use the sex ratio at birth to derive the total number of male births and female births. And if you're wondering why the spreadsheet, which is available on the Google Drive, is nearly 1 megabyte in size, it is for that reason, and that reason alone is that this brings in directly the data from the UNWPP's, the 2019 edition. And so you don't need to go and find those data yourself in order to be able to apply the spreadsheet. Obviously, when the UNWPP are updated, the intention is to update that hidden sheet there to the most recent version of the UNWPP data. So what we're going to do here is we are going to derive an estimate of birth completeness for South Africa from between 2011 and 2019, using the information on births for both sexes, which is what we were able to derive over here. In order to do so, the first step would be to do what we did in the previous session, which is to derive an estimate of the total number of births, regardless of when they were registered in your population, allowing for that incurred but not reported runoff triangle. And what we will then do is the spreadsheet will take those estimates and use them directly in a comparison with the UNWPP estimates. And that is done as I say, by ensuring that you have specified the correct country here. If you specify the incorrect country, it will look up the UNWPP data for the country you've specified. If you specify the wrong years, it will look up the UNWPP data for the years which have been specified in those two cells over there. And of course, that could induce some pretty drastic chaos into your data. Likewise, you do need to ensure that you have selected the correct version of, or the correct denominator here in your UNWPP data, which corresponds with your own data which you have put into the numerator. So we'd select both sexes over there. Again, if you're interested in the construction of the spreadsheet, I'll unhide here. There's another hidden sheet, which is designed to keep it away from people who want it to stop being corrupted. But basically, the population of the drop-down boxes is all hidden in these cells over here, the list of countries and the list of years, etc. But that's just being shown to you to convince you this is not a complete black box of what what is being presented over here. What we will then do is, having correctly specified all the information in the input data section of the country, the years, and what our denominator should be, having, if necessary, put in data here as to the numerator. Of course, if you had no information about late registration, all you had was the number of births by year of occurrence, regardless of when they were registered, you could just paste a single scalar, a single one-dimensional column into the first cell and ensure that all the other cells are 0. And it stands to reason that you would need to ensure that kind of only your data are in the cell. So if you only have, say, 3 years of data, you'd have to ensure that you delete all those data and set them to 0 to avoid corrupting your estimates with whatever's in the demonstration version of the spreadsheet. So if you didn't have data classified by the lag of the registration, you would just simply put the number of births occurring in each year in that first cell and set all these other cells to 0. On the completeness sheets, the estimation of completeness sheets of this workbook, this produces estimates of the completeness. What it does is it says for the years you've specified there, which is, we said on the input sheet from 2011 to 2019, it will firstly pick out what we call the year 0 registrations. Those are the registrations which were of births which occurred in 2011, which were registered in 2011, allowing for that slight delay for the statutory period, which might be some registrations in 2012. We'll also pick out the number of ultimate registrations, which is what has been produced by the analysis of the incurred but not reported events, which we did in our adjusted numerator sheet. And in fact, these cells are picked out from this tab over there. They're picked out from that column over there. And they are picked out from that column over there. The spreadsheet then, for each year, each calendar year which you looked at, and for the country you have specified, it then looks up from that massive database plundered from the UNWPP, the estimated number of events from the UNWPP data set, and puts them automatically there. That's what this formula does. It goes and looks up the information from the UNPD data, the WPP data set, and finds the correct value and automatically puts it into the spreadsheet. You'll notice here that I've created a further column, which, and if you just hold your mouse over it, it gives you some guidance to it. It's, that little red flag in the top right-hand corner tells you that there's a note attached to it, and it says this column could be either an alternative set of estimates from another source against which you want to compare the Unwpp estimates, or it could be a set of estimates, say, for a subpopulation, for something which the Unwpp cannot produce an estimate, and in which case you have to, the guidance is, sorry, I can't move my mouse over it because otherwise the box will disappear. The second asterisk that there says that you could use a set of estimates for a subpopulation which is not covered by the Unwpp, and in which case you are alerted to the fact that the cell B7 or the input sheet, this one here, must be set to use the other non-Unwpp data. Okay, just to avoid drawing spurious comparisons. It also just suggests that you change this cell to a more descriptive title, so it's not called other when you finally end up using those data, and I'll show that to you towards the end of the session. Simply from this information, from the year 0 number of registrations, remember those are the registrations occurring in that year, so registrations in that year of events occurring in that year, we can calculate the estimates of the completeness of births in each of the years relative to the Unwpp, which will be obtained by dividing that number of year 0 registrations divided by the total number of estimated births from the Unwpp. And we can do the same thing for our ultimate level of completeness, which is derived from that incurred but not reported runoff triangle, the chain ladder method. And we can pull that number divided by the Unwpp estimates and compare that to the Unwpp estimates. Simply by looking at these data, we can see that there's about a 5 or 6% discrepancy in the estimates of completeness between the year 0 and ultimate completeness. It's much higher in 2011 than for the other years, but it's of the order of about 5 or 6, possibly up to 8 or 9% difference. And that is why we engaged in that exercise, which was covered in the previous session, is that of the births registered in the year in which they occurred, we can see that in South Africa, that number has gradually improved from about 75% up to about 81%. There was something of a drop in 2016. Remember, that was the year when there was something odd in the data from the previous session. But we can see that around about 3/4 to 4/5 of births reported in each year from 2011 to 2019 are actually registered relative to what we would have expected from the Unwpp estimates. Once we allow for the fact that we know that in this country and in several other countries, delayed registration of births, substantially delayed registration of births, is an important feature of the registration system, we can get to a view that perhaps in general, give or take those odd blips in 2016 and 2017, we can see that our estimates of completeness on an ultimate basis is of the order of probably about 85 or 86%. In other words, saying that by the time all late registrations of events which have occurred, which have not been reported yet to the authorities, are taken into account. And remember, this is to some extent adjusted for something which we think is going to happen in the future. This says that by the time all births which might have been registered are registered, that somewhere just under 90% of all births in the country are likely to have been notified to the authorities. And so we can have these two very different estimates of completeness, both of which are valid in some senses. One is sorry, whoops, I've managed to lose something. Both of which are valid. The first is your estimate of the timeliness of our birth registrations. We can see that, you know, kind of roughly about 3/4 of births are notified to the authorities within within the year in which it was occurred. But once we allow for the late registration of births, a much higher degree of completeness is implied by our data. Sorry, my dog's just barking suddenly for some reason. Sorry, apologies. So within this, we can observe that we have two very different estimates of completeness, both of which are informative. The one, the year zero estimate, as I say, is a very good metric of how quickly births are registered in the country. Of course, not all those births are going to be registered within the statutory period. They're just simply registered in 2011 when they occurred in 2011. But it is a measure of quick registration of births. Whereas the ultimate one is saying what we expect ultimately once all those births have been notified to the authorities. And that gives you us a very different measure. If we go across to the figures tab here, let me just make this a little bit bigger. There's a series of figures which is produced here. There are two figures. The first is a plot of the actual number of events. So this is the registration of births. This gray line here is the comparator from the Unwpp data. The orange line is the number of ultimate registrations we expect to happen after application of the runoff triangle. The blue line is the year zero registrations. And we can simply see by looking at that, at the difference there, both the effect of allowing for the very late registration, that's the shift from the blue line to the orange line, as well as the overall level of births, which we expect from the Unwpp, which is this grayish line up at the top there. If we scroll down, we can see here, this is now a plot of our estimated completeness of births, birth registration. The titles of these graphs are pulled out from the information given on the inputs page over there. And we can see this blue line, the solid blue line, gives us our estimates of completeness of year zero registrations. The dashed line is our ultimate level of registrations. And we can see that, you know, kind of over the last 8 or 9 years in South Africa, that the year zero registrations have been broadly level at around about 80%. The ultimate completeness is broadly consistent at around about 85%. There is this weirdness in the data in 2015, 16, and 17, which now for the great reveal was because of a failure of the administration system to do accurate recording of births happening in hospitals in that year, leading to a reduction in the registration of births. But that was the result of a completely independent and separate investigation. There's a slightly annoying thing about the spreadsheet which cannot be resolved in Excel, which is that this yellow line here, which is marked as 0, and these orange lines here at the bottom, those are the plots of a further comparator estimate, which you'd get by using the information here. But one can't derive a way of plotting figures in Excel which only includes kind of that information if it's there or if it's not there. And so if one is really annoyed by this and wants to extract this plot, one could just simply highlight that series and delete it from the plot, and you'd be able to copy that and paste it into some report or some analytical document which you want to work with. So that would be an estimate of completeness relative to the Unwpp. Also, on this sheet, there's this gray block over here, which is really designed to act as an early warning system if in the derivation of your estimates that you are using information which might be compromised. And I just want to show this to you by arbitrarily shifting this data, say from 2016 through to 2024, say, okay, I'm not going to worry about changing the data. But if we use that now and go to the completeness sheet, notice that there are two warnings which appear. The first is that it points out that the estimates, anything beyond 2019, will be based on projections from the UN World Population prospects. So it's less governed by the actually observed data. And so it's just to alert you to the fact that you're now using, as your comparator estimates, information from a population projection rather than a quote unquote best estimate derived from empirical data. And the other warning which will appear is that if it incorporates the impact of COVID, or the period you've selected here includes the period covered by COVID, it will just alert you to the fact that COVID-19 may not have been taken into account in your estimates of your denominator for 2020 and 2021, and therefore that you should possibly treat those estimates with a degree of circumspection and caution in terms of how you interpret those results. And so that is just put there as a warning. You'll see also that if you try and do this for too long a period, remember the incurred but not reported analysis should not be done for more than 10 years. And so if you choose a period longer than that required, it will say to you, no, sorry, that can't be allowed, and you must now change that back to 2019, and that error message will disappear. So I have tried to make this spreadsheet as foolproof as possible. One of your jobs over the next couple of days is to try and break it as much as possible and to tell me what I haven't allowed for, and to try and see kind of if there are things which don't work in the spreadsheet. I have tried really hard to make sure that it does actually work as intended. But let's carry on then. And so this is the first thing was which we wanted to cover today was about using the Unwpp data, and I've shown you how to do that by using the spreadsheet. And the other thing which I want to demonstrate today is how you might want to use information from other data sources in conjunction, possibly with the Unwpp data, in order to derive estimates of completeness. And so we note that in some circumstances and for some investigations, the Unwpp may not be suitable for use. Okay, you might be wanting to work with data which is not routinely available from the Unwpp, or you might want to be doing an inequality assessment for a region of your country. And we know that the Unwpp does not provide estimates of the expected number of events at, say, a subnational level. Where that is the case, for those circumstances and for those investigations, you have to source alternative estimates of the denominator. Perhaps, National Statistics Office projections for subnational populations. So your National Statistical Office may produce a set of population estimates by different regions or provinces of your country, in which case you might want to use those outputs from those projections in your denominator. Or you might want to use bespoke population projection software. The most commonly used is software called Spectrum, which is freely available, which is set up to almost exactly, but not entirely exactly, reproduce the Unwpp estimates as its default set of projections. But one could set up a population projection in Spectrum to do a subnational population projection, and then extract the number of births for that subnational population from the results from Spectrum. Or it could be from another population projection produced internally to your country by an academic department or a bunch of researchers. If you are going to be using alternative estimates, there really are a number of very important investigations and concerns that you need to consider and address before using those population projections. Just as I said, you should not use the Unwpp data uncritically. The same applies, but to a much greater level of importance when using alternative population projections. And the reason for this is because a population projection is really only as good as the competence of the estimation methodology used to derive those estimates of the forces of demographic change, fertility, mortality, and migration, as are included in those models. And any errors in those assumptions will echo through quite dramatically into your population projections. So when using data from other sources, the kinds of questions you should ask, and these are not definitive, it's not the only questions you should ask, it's the kind of a starting guide. You should be asking yourself, are the annual estimates of births consistent and plausible? Do they concur with other estimates, so either from the Unwpp at the national level or from local knowledge down at a regional level? Are those estimates of births consistent and plausible? What assumptions, models, methods were used in the derivation of those estimates of the number of births? And here you need to make sure that what you're doing is that those assumptions are not drawing directly and exclusively on data from the CRVS system, because if your population projection is parameterized to reproduce the number of births identified in the CRVS, well, then you're setting in place a circular comparison that you're going to be comparing the estimates of births from the CRVS with your estimates of births from the CRVS, which are built in and baked into these population projections. So you do need to ensure that you're not inducing some circularity into that. Obviously, the assumptions about future trends in fertility might well be informed by the information from the CRVS, but they cannot be directly and exclusively drawn from that CRVS data. If you're working with data for a subpopulation, you need to ask how those estimates of the subpopulations were derived, which were used as your base population for your population projection. You need to worry about whether there have been provincial boundary changes from one time to another or over the course of that population projection, because suddenly then if a part of the map is now reallocated from one province to another province, that will instantaneously change your population dynamics in that in both the old and the new province, simply because there's been a redrawn line on a map, and you need to ask yourself those questions. There's a very technical question you need to ask yourself about the temporal definitions of the denominator, which you have to ask yourself, are the estimates appropriate for exactly the same definitions of time as you have for your numerator? So the Unwpp produces estimates for a calendar year basis, but other population projections might produce estimates which run from the middle of one year to the middle of the next, centered at the beginning of each year. And so you need to make sure that your definitions are the same between your numerator and your denominator. And finally, you need to ask this question about whether those estimates took into account the effects of COVID-19. So I'm going to give you an example implementation of how you might compare these data from another source. And what I'm going to do is, this is the results of an internal model which researchers in South Africa have used, which is a set of population projections and a demographic and epidemiological model for South Africa, starting in 1985. And this model is really actually about HIV. It was designed to produce estimates of the population overall, but then what proportion of the population had HIV, what proportion of the population was dying from AIDS every year. South Africa is very heavily affected, obviously, by an HIV/AIDS epidemic. And these population projections are produced internally by colleagues of mine at the University of Cape Town. And they offer an alternative take on both the UNWP estimates as well as the Stats South Africa estimates. And one of the outputs from this model is at line 140 of several hundred lines, is this estimate of the number of births in each calendar year from 2011 through to 2019. And so if we take those data and we just copy them, and I'm just going to dump them into another spreadsheet thing over here. I'm just going to paste those estimates into another workbook just by transposing them. So you go paste special values and you can transpose any set of values there. That's ones from 2011 to 2019. We could put it into there. So we can just have, these are an alternative set of estimates from 2011 to 2019 from an internal set of population projections produced for South Africa, which with particular awareness of the impact of HIV and AIDS. If we wanted to compare those results with the estimates from the UNWP, what we could do is we could say, well, let's go to our completeness sheet and let's just say we want to compare these with the model's name, which is called Tembisa. And we could take our estimates from 2011 to 2019, copy those and paste them from 2011 to 2019, making sure the years are properly lined up. And we could paste the values into the spreadsheet. And automatically, as soon as those cells are populated there, it will calculate the estimates of completeness of the birth registrations in South Africa relative to this Tembisa model, both on a year zero and an ultimate basis. If we go to our figures plot, you can now see it adds back a yellow line there, which is the total number of births projected by the Tembisa model. You can see it's actually incredibly close to the total number of births produced by the UNWP. And it will now compare and contrast the thick blue, the thick lines, the solid lines in blue are the UNWP estimates of completeness. The orange lines are the estimates of completeness from Tembisa. You can see they're almost identical from 2017 through to 2019. And we can see the overall number of registrations relative to those things, both on a year zero and an ultimate basis. And so this column over here allows to say, if we have an alternative set of estimates, which we want to directly compare and contrast with the UNWP estimates, well, then we can just, and they are defined equivalently, we can put those estimates into the cells over here and produce comparisons of those estimates of completeness. If we wanted to, in this case, because our registrations aren't changing, depending on whether we're comparing with UNWP or Tembisa, those are the registrations we have. We could still say, well, what is the differential between the UNWP and the Tembisa estimates? And so if we took, say, the Tembisa estimates of, the Tembisa year zero estimates divided by the UNWP estimates for zero, and we can see that the estimates of completeness of the Tembisa estimates was 3% higher in relative terms relative to the UNWP for 2011, and was almost exact for 2017 and 2018, but it's falling off a little bit in 2019. And so we can compare and see what kind of differentials there might be between the UNWP estimates and the alternative sets of estimates which we have derived over here. Those kind of comparisons become even more interesting when we want to, and this is one of the exercises I'll be talking about just now, which we're going to go through tomorrow, when we do an investigation of relative completeness of births for males and females. In which case, what we'd be doing is we'd be doing this exercise for male births, say, using the data we have, compared with the UNWP births for males, do the same exercise for females, and then we can compare the relative completeness and trends in completeness for male registrations and female registrations over time in the same country, relative either to the UNWP or to each other. And that really starts to advance one's understandings of the relative completeness of the exercise and the relative completeness of one's civil registration and vital statistics system. The very last thing I need to just point out here is that if you specify that you're using something for which there is no UNWP comparator. So in this example, there was data from the UNWP which we could use to compare, and we wanted to compare our own internal data with the UNWP. If we set this to say we only want to use data for which there is no comparator in the UNWP, you would then, it would suddenly pop up this box over here saying, please describe what those data are. And in your completeness estimates here, your comparators, you'd have to make sure that your denominator from whatever source is going to be relevant to whatever the information here from your registration of vital events is going to be. So briefly, before I open up for questions, I just want to momentarily talk you through the nature and the process of how we are going to go about doing these practical exercises tomorrow. And so let me just go over here. This is the Google Drive for the regional workshop. If we go to meeting documents and practical material, you'll see there's a PDF of the instructions for tomorrow's practical, as well as some data for tomorrow's practical, which I'll talk about just now. If we go back to meeting documents, and at the top here, there's this PDF called Guidelines for Data, which I hope you have managed to look at. And this really asks you to try and get from your own country's data information which will help you do these practical exercises better. And if you are not able to access the data which is specified here, the information available in the workshop practical session over there, the workshop data, Prac 1 data, will has data which you might want to work with instead, but of course will be less relevant to your own country's situation. Please, if you can, these are not complicated tabulations. There are 5 suggested tabulations which I asked you to try and extract for the purpose of this workshop. They give you suggestions of where they'd come from, other information which you might want to try and get access to help you understand your data better. I provide a sample template of what your data should look like when they're extracted. And I'm going to ask you to produce information by year of occurrence and year of registration for births, same tabulation for deaths. If you've got national population projections, estimated number of births in each calendar year, similarly for the number of deaths in each calendar year from national population projections, disaggregated by the sex of the birth if possible, etc. And so ideally, I'd like to ask you to try and get this information. I've classified the tabulations as either desirable, saying I really hope you should be able to get that information quickly, optional, it might take a little bit more time, but you might be able to get that information relatively simply. And finally, this 5th tabulation, which we'll be covering in the instructional time on Thursday, is information from your most recent census of the population count of children up to the age of 14 for both sexes, and population of women in 5-year age groups from your most recent census. And if you could try and extract that information, that would be a real bonus as well. So I'm going to open up now for any comments, questions, things you didn't understand, things you'd like me to go over. Otherwise, let's first hear with their comments and questions, and I'll answer those, and then I'll just briefly wrap up with saying how I hope, this is, it just really is hoping, tomorrow is going to work. Any questions? Anything which you'd like me to re-explain? What you'll find in the practical sessions tomorrow is that I see this question in the chat now, I'll answer it now, is that you'll be using that resources spreadsheet intensively to go through these exercises. I've provided, as I say, data, if you don't have your own data, which will ask you to think about various things. But obviously, if you do have your own data, it would make it a whole lot easier. Okay, Batul, thanks for your question. Batul from Pakistan, for those of you who are not following the chats, asked, what are the possibilities of over or underestimation of derived estimates for years not having no data record or not registered? Batul, that goes back to the session earlier today, the first session of today, where I talked about the assumptions underlying the chain ladder, the IBNR method. And if there are changes over time in the pattern of those late registrations, that will have a direct material impact, because that whole method of filling in that incomplete portion of the triangle is predicated, it runs on the assumption that those time patterns and the patterns of delay do not change over time. The only recommendation I can give is that if you observe that those patterns are changing over time, and you can explain why those patterns are changing over time, is to only work with a subset of the data to fill in the portions where you can make that assumption. At the end of the day, however, and again, I must be completely clear about that, those levels of ultimate registration are based on a set of assumptions. They're based on a mathematical formula which says this is what we expect to happen in the future based on what's happened in the past. The point about, and the reason for doing those ultimate estimates of completeness is because those year zero estimates of completeness are themselves deficient under those circumstances and do not give a complete and accurate version. They give a very good indicator as to how quickly births are being registered within the year in which they occur. But it doesn't allow for the fact that maybe there are substantial registrations happening. We saw in the South African data I've just given that those estimates of completeness might rise by 5 or 6, 7, possibly 10% in some years. And that is important information, okay, which I think one should bear in mind in doing those assessments of your analysis. And we also know that if you don't allow for that runoff triangle, if you don't allow for those late registrations, but only allow for the total number of registrations, well, then your estimate of births 10 years previously will include late registrations, whereas your births, in my example for 2019, can't include late registrations. And that will itself produce a very odd tabulation of estimates of the completeness. It will show your estimates of completeness are going down over time. And that is also not helpful. So by producing estimates on both bases, both on a year zero and on an assumed what we think might happen ultimate basis, is to give you a sense of two estimates which are comparable with each other, both of which allow for the same amount of periods of time for late registrations. Obviously, your more recent ones will include a greater accommodation of what might happen in the future, but at least will allow you to say what is happening to that overall level of completeness of birth registrations, which of course is one of the SDGs. That the SDGs says we want births registered, and preferably pretty much immediately, so people have an identity. But that might not always happen, and so maybe that ultimate level of completeness is also important for understanding progress towards meeting the SDGs. So I mean, Batul, I accept that there might well be errors. One hopes that the errors are not material. Certainly in my experience of working with these methods, they tend to be fairly robust, providing you can make that assumption that there aren't any time change patterns. There's a question from Izan from Brunei, saying among all the methods you have mentioned, which is then really recommended to use? I know this is subject to the availability of the data. What I've been trying to say in part, my answer to Batul is that you should really be trying to do this in as many ways as possible. You know, we say use the UNWP estimates. Well, that is helpful, that is good, that is recommended. But then to probably try, if you know you've got significant late registrations, do it both on a year zero and an ultimate basis. That will give you two different answers. If you have a reliable set of population projections for your country, I could have used the ones from Stats SA as the counterfactual, but actually I used those in one of the examples in the practical exercise for tomorrow, so I didn't want to give you the answers. You might want to use those and say, you know, kind of, do those answers produce more or less the same estimates as indicated by the UNWP? If all those estimates start lining up together, and you know, I mean, an absolute difference. Let me just go back here. Yeah, an absolute difference. Sorry, I've now made a mess of this. Both sexes, completeness. We can see here, if we compare the UNWP estimates in year zero for 2013 and the 10B estimates, they're basically kind of same order of magnitude levels of completeness: 81%, 80.4%, 76.5, 78.5. Our estimates of ultimate completeness are broadly coherent. That is saying we are more certain, we are more confident in how these data might reflect accurately the completeness. If they give radically different answers, then you have to start asking, kind of, are these Tembisa estimates crazily wrong? Has the UNWP not taken something into account in South Africa? Yes, there are differences. We can see it in the figures of the estimated total number of births, but in the scheme of things, it's really not a big difference. And so the answer is to really try and do as much of this in as many ways as possible. To unpack the data against everything you can possibly think of. And the more times you say, oh, and this estimate agrees with that one, and this one agrees with that one, that gives you confidence that this might be something. Where they disagree, that says to you, go and try and work out what's causing them to disagree. So, kind of my advice, if anything, is to start off always nationally, use the UNWP as a benchmark, just to say, let's get a peg in the ground, because those are unlikely to be catastrophically wrong. Then you start saying, now what else do we get with on a year zero basis and ultimate basis, on comparing with other projections, other estimates. Let's drill down to using national population projections for a subpopulation, for a province, for example, where if you are certain that at a national level, your national population projections in the UNWP are more or less the same, then you can say, well, let's try and use those data from the population projections produced by the NSO to say, now let's see what happens with birth registration by province. Are there important differentials? Might that tell you that there are administrative issues with your coverage or with your birth registration completeness? So I think that the answer really lies in saying, do as much as you can here. Sheila Sakar asked a similar question. For estimating subnational level data, can we use the same method? Absolutely. This is infinitely flexible, provided you can find the data which you can use. So if the government of Pakistan and the National Statistical Office produces provincial or district level estimates of populations with the required outputs, and you have the vital registration information for those districts, absolutely do this by sex within a district if you have enough numbers. So yeah, I hope that answers it. Okay, there's a question from Ui Kitakun from Laos. Wanted to cross-check if the Google link you shared and presented was for us, every participant to complete the exercise. Yes. So you asked me basically how I see this going. It's going to, look, I think the short answer is going to be we're going to have an interesting time tomorrow. So what I've done is I want this to be relevant for you. If you're from Laos, I want it to be relevant to the People's Democratic Republic of Laos. And so what I've asked you to do, I've asked all the attendees to do, is to try and ferret out what I think should be fairly readily accessible data for people, for the attendees in this workshop who are by and large associated with the national governments, to be able to get data from their national statistical agency or from their national CRVS system to be able to try and apply these methods to their own data. I would prefer you to work with your own data. Why? Because actually, if you're sitting in Laos, I'm sure you're not that interested in data from South Africa, quite frankly. Okay. And so it will be less relevant if you use the information which I provided. I've also pulled out some data from Thailand for one of the exercises, but it's not going to be relevant to you. So I would rather you had your own data. That, of course, adds some significant chaos into the process. Because if I said to you, just do my exercise with my data, I could, I understand it all and I can talk you through it and understand it and be well prepared. Whereas if tomorrow you arrive with your data from the Laos Central Statistical Office, and I've never seen those data before, and I'm trying to get my head around it, it's going to be interesting for me as well. But that's my challenge. But I want this to be relevant to you. So what I'm hoping, and this is for all the attendees, is that you do and are able to access your own data. What I have asked the organizers who've set up this meeting to do is to set up breakout rooms where people will be, I'm hoping that attendees will say, hi, I'm Ui from Laos. I have tried to apply this method to my data and I'm having a problem, and I'd call you into a breakout room where you and I could have a one-on-one chat. Well, I try and get my head around your data in next to no time whatsoever and try and understand what is going on, and to offer you direct advice. And so I'm hoping that that's how it's going to work. The time is not really meant, I'm hoping also that you might be able to start playing with the spreadsheet long before tomorrow's session, and to actually arrive with questions rather than arrive saying, oh, let me get started on exercise 1 as we start. So if you're looking for a great deal of certainty of exactly how this is going to pan out, I'm really not sure, but I think it's going to work. And I've allocated quite a lot of time of my own time to be available for those one-on-one chats. And if necessary, if it's something that I think is kind of indicating that there's a general misunderstanding, I might call the group back together, say, let's all reconvene momentarily. In order to explain something which is clearly I didn't explain properly the first time. We'll have to see how it goes, unfortunately, but I do hope that it will work, and I hope that, I really do hope that this is information and an approach which you will come out of this workshop having been able to say, yes, no, I was able to at least come up with a first couple of sets of estimates of the completeness for my data, and that would be a worthwhile thing. So a little bit scary for everyone, but and particularly for me, but I think that's the way it's going to go. Right. Question from Armenia, from Karine Kuyumian. I'd like to know, for the official statistical purpose, is it more relevant to publish the estimated deaths and births, or the percent completeness of registration? What I'm trying to suggest here is that I think, in a world of increased demands for transparency, I think that what I'm trying to do here is act as a Trojan horse for trying to get more information out there. And so what I would like to see every national statistical office, not only within the ESCAP region, but globally, is that when these completeness exercises are being reported or being written up, that firstly, the underlying data are made routinely available. My own country, Stats South Africa, for all its internal problems and deficiencies, is incredibly good at making whatever data it has available on the web. You from Armenia could go to the Stats South Africa website and actually download 17 million birth records covering the period 1998 to 2020. It's an amazing achievement. But not all countries do that, and I think the first thing would be for countries to be putting those data, the unit record data, out in the public domain, suitably de-anonymized. When reports on civil registration completeness are being written, I would like to see all of the above presented. I would like to see what is actually in your data, what actually has been reported. So kind of almost something like a table which looked something, I think I'm sharing this. No, I'm not sharing it. Let me just share this. I would like to see a table which looks something like that being produced in your country's national statistical vital statistics completeness report. So anyone looking at your data can understand what the implications of late registration might be. I would also like to then see in any country's reports, let's just take these data out for the time being, something like that. Okay, a set saying these are the registrations in any year for the last 9-10 years in our country, which were occurred and registered in the same year, allowing for that very technical thing of the timely registration in the following year. Here, what we think, based on a run-off triangle, are the ultimate number of births which might be notified to us in the future. And of course, we can track that then every year. We can compare and contrast how well the method is working in your country. We have the estimates from the Unwpp, and we have the estimates of completeness. I would like to see it all out there, and that way, we are contributing to saying not only are we aware of what the issues are, we can actually see that South Africa has a significant problem of delayed registration, and if you only look at the year zero completeness, you're not actually adequately reflecting how well the vital statistics system works. And so ideally, none of this should not be in the public domain, as long as in the process of explaining, saying, listen, that estimate there and the discrepancy between those two estimates for 2019 in South Africa is because this is the result of an approach which tries to accommodate things which might be notified in 5, 6, 7 years into the future, but is nonetheless a helpful way of understanding our data. And if we explain it that way, there's no embarrassment to the statistical office if in 2029 we look back and say, actually, that number was 1.020 million births or 1.060 million births, saying, well, at the time, that was our best estimate of what we thought might be notified to us. And over time, the overall completeness will eventually stabilize, because not many births are going to be registered 9, 10, 11, 12 years after they occurred. And we'll eventually say that was the proportion of the births that occurred in that year, which we expected to have occurred in that year, which were ultimately entered onto our vital statistical system. So I think we should be aiming for it all. Yeah. Okay. So I hope that helps. Okay, there's a question from Tashi from Bhutan again. Thank you very much. It says, in using the sheet provided in Google Drive, your opinion that the moment you choose the country input section, sorry, whoops, my message just jumped. You'll be provided the data that country particularly extracted. This doesn't happen in my case, in this case, yikes. All right, sorry. Let's, if we put Bhutan in there, completeness. Yeah, Tashi, maybe just email me. I'm going to type my email address in the box. I think it's managed to populate the UN estimates there. Yeah, kind of the births for Bhutan, and notice it actually corrects the title over there. So I'm not sure if I understand your questions. Maybe it's to email me offline. I'm certainly not promising that my spreadsheet is completely error-free and bug-free. But so I accept that I might have made a mistake. So please try and explain to me via an email, and I'll try and address it before this time tomorrow. Okay, everyone, I apologize we've gone slightly over time, but the questions have been really valuable. There's a saying which we use in academia that you learn more from your students than your students ever learn from you. And in many ways, the kinds of questions which have been posed there, they give the truth to that statement. I'm very grateful for it. As I say, I'm looking forward to tomorrow with some degree of trepidation, but that's because I have to manage it. But that said, I hope that this morning's afternoon sessions, evening sessions for those of you in Samoa, it's probably very late at night for you, have provided you some indication of the kinds of things you're going to be doing. We will convene tomorrow. As I said, join the teams. You can either post questions in chat, and we will then invite you to breakout rooms as and when, if you need to, or we can pose questions in the chat, and we can muddle our way through it. I want you to really try and do this to all as much as you can for yourselves, but I have to be here to help hold your hand and guide you and take you along this journey. And we'll reconvene fully on Thursday for 2 sessions on finishing off birth registration and looking at death registration. Frankly, I mean, if you wanted to preempt some of the sessions, the death registration, the generic death registration relative to the Unwpp is very, very similar to what we've been covered, which is why it's been covered in a very short time on Thursday. It's going to be saying, listen, do exactly what we've done today, but just now do it with the deaths. So if you feel like jumping ahead and say, listen, actually, you're not interested in births, you're interested in deaths, see what you can do in the meantime. And I'll try and answer questions on that tomorrow as well, if that's what you're interested in. I want this to work for you far more than for you to do my little step-by-step exercises. But if you do get stuck with data, I have information for you to use. So thank you all very much. I really do hope it was useful. I hope you're not utterly bored with my voice. But we'll pick it up tomorrow, and we'll take it up with more instruction on Thursday. I will remain online to answer questions in the chat for a little while, even if my video is off. And if anyone wants to carry on chatting for a little while, please carry on. Otherwise, those in Samoa, good night. Those in Bangkok, enjoy your afternoon.